The planet called Enoch 9 had been dying for months. Not the quick death of orbital bombardment or the efficient purge of exterminatus. This was a slow rot, a spiritual decay that crept through the population like poison through veins. The Great Rift had opened a wound across the sky, and through that wound, something had begun to whisper. The shrine world had once housed billions. Pilgrims traveled years through the void to walk its processional ways, to touch relics, blessed by saints whose names had outlasted their deeds. The Cathedral of Eternal Vigil stretched kilometers into the sky, its spires like accusations against heaven itself. Gothic architecture turned brutalist beauty, weaponized into intimidation. Every surface bore the aquila. Every wall screamed devotion through carved stone and stained glass that filtered light into shades of sanctioned worship. Now those windows showed colors no artisan had intended. The faithful who remained saw visions in the light. They heard hymns in frequencies that made their teeth ache. They touched the altars and felt something touch back. Inquisitor Lord Severian Holt stood in what had been the plaza of 10,000 martyrs and watched his men work. The Geller anchor rose from the cathedral square like a broken spine, all exposed mechanisms and jury-rigged power conduits. Tech priests moved through its shadows, chanting the litany of ignition in binary, while servitors hauled cable thick as a man's torso. At the center, locked in their restraint thrones, the Psyker choir waited. Holt had requisitioned them from a black ship. 12 souls each, potent enough to warrant the journey to Terra. Each powerful enough to fuel the anchor for perhaps a day before their minds burned clean. The Ordo Malleus had calculated acceptable losses. The choir fell within those parameters. 30 minutes to activation. The tech priest's voice crackled through a vox grill that had been a mouth once. The machine spirit is reluctant. Make it willing. Holt's tone carried no room for negotiation. He had not spent 3 months planning this operation to tolerate hesitation from cogwork and prayers. The anchor was experimental, technically heretical. It borrowed principles from Geller field generators and twisted them into something new. Something that created not merely a bubble of reality within the warp, but a hardened space where the physical laws refused to bend. Where demons could not manifest through emotional resonance alone. Where the veil stayed thick. In theory, Holt had read the casualty projections. He had signed them. Behind him, ceramite boots struck stone in perfect rhythm. Brother Captain Acastus Vale approached with the inevitable weight of a glacial advance, his Aegis power armor catching the diseased light and turning it silver. The Grey Knights had arrived 3 days ago, and Holt had felt the shift immediately. When demon hunters entered a world, even the warp flinched. Inquisitor. Vale's voice emerged flat, processed through his helm's vox system. He had not removed it since planetfall. Grey Knights rarely showed their faces where corruption had taken root. My brothers report the perimeter secure. The wards hold. For now. Holt watched the choir. One of them, a girl perhaps 16 standard years, had begun to weep blood. She did not seem to notice. When the anchor activates, there will be a moment of instability. A shear in local reality as the field engages. And you believe this will attract what you seek. I believe it will either attract or expel. Either outcome serves. Vale tilted his helmeted head fractionally. The Grey Knight had not questioned Holt's authority. None of them had. The Ordo Malleus held dominion over all matters daemonic, and this world had become such a matter entirely. But Holt could feel the unspoken judgment. Grey Knights considered themselves incorruptible. They viewed pragmatism as the first step toward damnation. Let them judge. Holt had learned long ago that purity was a luxury purchased with other people's blood. 5 minutes. The tech priest's announcement carried a note that might have been fear. Difficult to tell through augmetics. The choir began to scream, not in terror, not yet. This was the sound of psychic pressure building of minds forced to bridge the gap between material and immaterial. The restraint thrones held them upright as their backs arched, as their hands clawed at armrests, bolted specifically to withstand such reactions. Holt had watched this before. He did not look away. The anchor ignited. Light bloomed from its core. Not clean like fire, but oily refractive. A luminescence that seemed to bend away from itself. The air developed texture. Pressure built in Holt's ears, as if he stood at the bottom of an ocean that had suddenly remembered gravity. Around the plaza's perimeter, reality began to solidify in a way it had no business doing. The temperature dropped. Frost crept across stone that had baked under this world's dying sun for 10,000 years. In the warp shadow overhead, something screamed back. The rift writhed. Its edges, already ragged with corruption, tore further. Not wider. Deeper. As if something on the other side had noticed the anchor's activation and decided to investigate by force. Contact. Vale's voice remained level. His brothers had already moved into firing positions. Stormbolters raised every weapon blessed by rites that predated the Imperium itself. Warp breach probability increasing. Holt opened his mouth to give the order to reinforce the wards. The anchor field stuttered, not failed. Stuttered. As if something had struck it from a direction that did not exist in three-dimensional space. The light twisted, developed an edge it should not possess. One of the psychers burst, not exploded. Burst. Her body came apart like smoke, like she had never been solid at all. And in the space where she had existed, the air folded. Holt saw it fold. Saw reality crease like paper, saw the crease sharpen into a line, saw the line open. She stepped through. Number. Stepped suggested effort. She arrived as if the universe had suddenly corrected a clerical error by placing her exactly where she belonged. One moment absence, the next presence, with no transition between states to mark the difference. Holt's first thought, trained by decades of identifying threats, cataloged the obvious. Female. Tall. The kind of poise that came from absolute certainty about one's place in any given hierarchy. She wore black like other people wore skin, a suit that moved with her in ways fabric should not move. Glasses caught the anchor's light and turned it into weapons-grade dismissal. His second thought, the one that came from instinct rather than training, was simpler. This was not warp-touched. Vale had already opened fire. The storm bolter roared mass reactive rounds designed to punch through ceramite and detonate inside whatever lay beneath. Each bolt had been consecrated. Each carried enough explosive force to reduce an unarmored human to constituent atoms. She moved and the rounds went elsewhere, not dodged. Holt had seen combat precognition before, had watched psychers twist away from fire before triggers were pulled. This was different. She moved like a woman walking through her own living room, adjusting her path to avoid furniture she knew by heart. Casual, bored almost. The bolt struck stone and ceramite and empty air, and she kept walking, kept approaching the center of the plaza as if Brother Captain Vale and his demon hunters were street vendors she had politely declined. Ceasefire! Holt's command cut through the thunder of guns. Vale hesitated for perhaps half a second before obeying his training, recognizing inquisitorial authority even when his judgment screamed otherwise. The woman stopped, looked around the plaza. Her gaze swept over the anchor, the choir, the Grey Knights, Holt himself. A smile touched her lips. Not cruel, worse than cruel, amused. Well. Her voice carried across the plaza without strain, without amplification. Cultured, precise. Each word enunciated like she had all the time in the universe to speak and found the act of doing so vaguely entertaining. This is new. Holt activated his auspex. The device cycled through scanning modes, thermal, psychic, residual, warp energy. The readings made no sense. No demonic signature, no possession markers, No corruption index beyond what the planet's ambient taint would explain. But something about her made the machine hesitate, as if it did not quite know what categories to apply. Identify yourself. His voice remained steady. Give nothing away. Not fear, not uncertainty, not the cold certainty that he had just made a terrible miscalculation. She tilted her head. The gesture managed to convey both mockery and genuine consideration. You're the one who pulled me here, darling. She glanced at the anchor, and something in that glance suggested she understood its function better than the tech priests who built it. Interesting toy. A bit desperate, though. Reality stabilizer. In this neighborhood? Her smile widened. Someone's been losing ground. Vale took one step forward. His nemesis force sword blazed with psychic fire, with wards that could cut demon flesh and send the immaterial screaming back to the warp. Witch. Oh, I've been called worse. She examined her fingernails. Usually right before someone learned the difference between accusation and demonstration. Stand down, brother captain. Holt moved between them. Not protection. Positioning. Vale would kill her if ordered. The question was whether such an order would accomplish anything beyond proving she could kill faster. He met her gaze. Behind those glasses, he saw something that made his tactical assessment revise itself entirely. She was not afraid. Not defiant, not desperate, not playing games to buy time or leverage. She simply stood there confident in a way that suggested the entire situation. The weapons, the warriors, the rotting planet and its screaming sky. All of it existed as context for whatever came next. And what came next was hers to decide. You have one opportunity to explain why I should not have you purged where you stand. Holt kept his tone flat. Authority without theater. The Inquisition did not bluff. Her smile never wavered. Because you need me. She looked past him toward the rift overhead. Because that thing in your sky is about to get worse. Because you spent 3 months and 12 expendable psychers building a desperate solution to a problem you don't fully understand. She looked back at him. And because I'm already here, which means your little reality anchor just opened a door you didn't know existed. So the real question, Inquisitor, isn't whether you can afford to keep me alive. The anchor field pulsed. The remaining psychers screamed in unison. Overhead, the rift began to laugh. The question is whether you can afford not to. Holt stared at her for 3 seconds. Calculated probabilities. Weighed options. Made the choice that would define everything that followed. Detain her. Non-lethal protocols. Hexagrammic restraints. He turned to the tech priest. Get that anchor stable. Now. As Vale's brothers moved to execute the order, Holt allowed himself one brief moment of doubt. He had spent his career learning to identify threats, had trained himself to recognize corruption in all its forms, had purged worlds and watched good people die to contain what must not spread. This woman was not corrupted. She was something else entirely, and on a planet drowning in Slaaneish's whispers, where the veil between worlds had worn thin enough to bleed through, he had just invited her to stay. The anchor stabilized. The psychers stopped screaming. In the silence that followed, Holt could hear the rift overhead still laughing. 48 hours, he decided. He would give her 48 hours to prove herself useful. After that, she burned like everything else that did not belong. Simple, clean, absolutely necessary. He ignored the small voice in the back of his mind that suggested she had already anticipated this plan and found it adorable. The cathedrals under Croft had survived worse than war. Its vaulted ceiling bore scorch marks from battles fought before the Imperium learned to count centuries in 5 digits. Frescoes depicting saints the ecclesiarchy, no longer acknowledged, stared down from smoke-blackened stone. Somewhere above, the faithful had once gathered to sing hymns. Now the space served a more practical purpose. Interrogation, confinement, the management of uncomfortable truths. Bayonetta sat in the chair they had provided and looked profoundly unimpressed. The hexagrammic wards formed a cage around her, their geometry precise enough to make reality uncomfortable. Symbols that predated Imperial Gothic crawled across the floor in silver and ash, each one a word in a language demons feared. The restraints themselves were not physical. Nothing so crude as chains. The wards created a space where certain actions simply refused to complete, where movement beyond prescribed boundaries met resistance from the universe itself. She had tested them once, stood walked to the edge, pressed one hand against the invisible boundary. The air had rippled like disturbed water. She had smiled, returned to her chair, and proceeded to examine her fingernails as if the entire apparatus bored her to tears. Holt stood outside the wards and studied her. 3 hours had passed since the anchor's activation. 3 hours during which his command staff had argued in circles about protocol contamination risk and whether summary execution qualified as prudence or waste. The Grey Knights wanted her dead. The Adepta Sororitas wanted her burned. The tech priests wanted to know what she was before committing to an opinion. Holt wanted answers. "You arrived through a reality shear." He began without preamble. Small talk was a luxury. Not a warp rift, not a possession. The anchor's stabilization field created a localized anomaly, and you emerged from it fully formed. Is that a question, darling, or are you just thinking out loud? She had not looked at him, still examining those nails. How? How what? How did a technology designed to repel warp incursion become a door for something else entirely? Now she looked up. The smile that touched her lips carried no warmth, only the recognition of someone who had heard a particularly entertaining joke. Because your little machine isn't just keeping things out, sweetheart. It's pinning reality down so hard, it's creating pressure differentials. Weak points. Places where the fabric gets thin in directions your tech priests don't have names for. She leaned back in the chair, crossed her legs. You built an anchor to keep the ocean out. I slipped through the crack in the hull. Brother Captain Vale spoke from his position near the entrance. He had not moved in the 3 hours since they had secured the undercroft. Statues demonstrated more fidget, witchcraft, among other things. She glanced at him. Tell me, do all of you speak exclusively in accusations, or is it just the ones in the fancy armor? Enough! Holt's command carried the weight of absolute authority. He had not survived 30 years in the Ordo Malleus by tolerating chaos in his own command structure. Brother Captain, your assessment? Vale's helm turned fractionally. Even through the armor, Holt could feel the Grey Knight's reluctance to speak. She registers no corruption index, no possession markers, no psychic signature consistent with demonic influence. Each word arrived with visible effort. The Aegis does not react to her presence. She is, he paused, unclassified. Unclassified. Holt repeated the word like a diagnosis. That's your professional opinion, unclassified. The phenomenon has no precedent in our records. From the shadows near the far wall, another voice joined the conversation. Canoness Preceptor. Licinia Thorn had arrived an hour ago, with what remained of her order. The Adepta Sororitas had taken heavy losses holding the cathedral district. Of the 300 sisters who had answered the call to Enoch, 947 survived. They had fought with the desperate faith of those who knew. Their emperor watched, who believed suffering itself was prayer. Thorn stepped forward into the light cast by the glow globes. Her armor bore the scars of close combat ceramite, scorched black in places where demonic claws had tested the Emperor's protection and found it adequate. Her face showed no such marks. Hard, weathered. The face of someone who had looked into the abyss and decided the abyss needed better manners. We do not require classification to recognize heresy. Her voice carried the absolute certainty of revealed truth. She manifests through sorcery. She mocks the Emperor's servants, She exists in defiance of natural law. Thorn's hand moved to the bolt pistol at her hip. The sentence is clear. The sentence, Holt said softly, is mine to determine. Silence filled the undercroft. The kind of silence that preceded violence or submission, and the choice between them hung suspended like a blade. Thorn did not draw her weapon, but she did not move her hand away from it either. You test my faith, Inquisitor. I test your discipline. Holt met her gaze without flinching. Faith without discipline is just noise. And I have enough noise on this planet already. He turned back to Bayonetta, who had watched the entire exchange with the detached interest of someone observing theater they had already seen better versions of. You said we need you. Elaborate. She uncrossed her legs, stood. The wards flickered but held, as she approached their boundary close enough that Holt could see his reflection in those glasses. That thing in your sky. She gestured vaguely upward toward the rift, bleeding corruption across the heavens. It's not just a tear in the veil. It's an invitation. Something on the other side has been knocking, and recently your population decided to answer. Her smile turned sharper. Cults, possession, mass hysteria flavored like religious ecstasy. Very on brand for this particular flavor of corruption. Slaanesh. Vale spoke the name like a curse, which it was. The Prince of Excess. Oh good, you do know how to say something besides heresy and purge. There's hope for you yet. Bayonetta's tone remained light, but something in her posture shifted. Became more serious without losing its edge. Here's what you're facing. A full demonic incursion is building. Not random, not opportunistic, orchestrated. Someone on the other side is using your population's spiritual decay as fuel, turning their obsession into a beacon. Give it another week, maybe less, and that rift is going to birth something that makes your current problems look quaint. Holt activated his data slate. Cross-referenced her statement against reports from the front lines. Casualty projections, psychic disturbance metrics. The numbers align too well. You claim to know this how? Because I've seen it before. Different world, different circumstances, same basic problem. She tapped the ward boundary, and the air rippled with contained light. Entities that feed on obsession that turn desire into weaponized corruption. They're predictable once you understand the pattern. And you understand the pattern. Darling, I wrote the manual on dealing with things that think seduction is the same as conquest. The smile returned cold and amused. The difference is I never lost. Thorn's restraint broke. Lies. Blasphemy. She speaks as if she has trafficked with demons and emerged unscathed. Such things do not exist. Cannot exist. The Emperor's light. The Emperor's light, Bayonetta interrupted, is doing a stellar job keeping your planet from imploding immediately. But let's be practical here. You're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and running out of time. Your anchor is buying you hours, maybe days. After that, she shrugged. This world becomes another footnote in someone's tragedy collection. Holt raised one hand. Thorn fell silent, though her fury remained visible in the set of her shoulders. Assume for the moment I believe you. Assume you possess knowledge relevant to our situation. He kept his voice level. Clinical. What would you require to assist us? Freedom of movement, access to wherever this incursion is strongest, and... She glanced at the wards at the Grey Knights at Thorn. A little trust would be nice, but I'm not holding my breath. Trust. Vale's voice carried something that might have been dark humor. You ask for trust while standing in a containment field, because you represent an unknown threat to Imperial security. I ask for pragmatism while standing in a cage, because you're terrified of things you don't understand. Bayonetta's smile never wavered. There's a difference. Holt made his decision. Not because he trusted her, not because he believed her claims, because in his 3 decades serving the Ordo Malleus, he had learned to recognize when conventional solutions would not suffice. And this situation had stopped being conventional the moment the anchor tore reality and deposited her in his plaza. You will be released under strict protocols. Brother Captain Vale will assign 2 of his warriors as escort. You will submit to psychic monitoring. You will engage threats as directed, and only as directed. He paused. Any deviation from these parameters results in immediate termination. Non-negotiable. How very generous. But she inclined her head slightly. Acknowledgement, if not agreement. You have 48 hours to demonstrate your value. Prove yourself an asset, and we continue this arrangement. Prove yourself a liability. He did not need to finish the sentence. And if I prove myself indispensable, then you remain an asset until you are not. Nothing more. She laughed. Just once, brief and sharp. You know, I almost respect that. No pretense. No pretty speeches about the greater good. Just cold, calculated self-interest. The glasses caught the light again. We're going to get along beautifully. Holt gestured to the tech priest waiting in the shadows. The wards deactivated with a sound like broken glass scraped across stone. Bayonetta stepped through the space they had occupied as if they had never existed. Vale moved immediately into position. 2 of his brothers flanked her storm bolters held at ready. Not aimed, not yet, but prepared. There's one more thing you should know, Inquisitor. Bayonetta paused at the threshold. Your anchor, it's brilliant. Desperate and probably heretical, but brilliant. It's also failing. Holt's blood went cold. Explain. Every time it stabilizes reality around your little bubble, the warp pushes back. And every time the warp pushes back, the anchor has to work harder to maintain the field. It's a losing equation. You're trying to hold back an ocean with a dam made of wishes and corpses. She glanced back at him. How long did your tech priests say the Psyker Choir could sustain it? 72 hours, optimistically. Cut that in half, maybe thirds. Her expression was no longer amused. Whatever we're going to do, we do it fast. Because when that anchor fails, and it will fail, everything you've been keeping outside is going to come flooding in at once. She left. The gray nights followed their heavy footfalls, echoing through the undercroft, until silence returned. Thorn spoke first. You have made a grievous error. Noted? Holt pulled up the anchor's telemetry on his data slate. The numbers confirmed what Bayonetta had said. Power consumption increasing. Choir vitals degrading faster than projected. 48 hours was optimistic. 36 more realistic. I will pray for your soul, Inquisitor. Pray for the mission canoness. My soul is already spoken for. Thorn departed without another word, leaving Holt alone with his decisions. He pulled up the tactical map. Cult strongholds marked in red. Warp disturbance nodes pulsing like infected wounds. The anchor at the center, a fragile point of light surrounded by darkness. Somewhere above the rift continued its slow consumption of the sky. Holt added a new parameter to the mission logs. Asset classification, Umbra anomaly. Status conditionally deployed. Termination authorization standing. 48 hours to save a world or condemn it. He had faced worse odds. The lie came easily now. He had been telling it for years. The Plaza of Sacred Contemplation had earned its name in better times. Pilgrims once gathered here to meditate on the Emperor's glory, to kneel on stone worn smooth by 10,000 years of devotion. Statuary lined the perimeter, each figure depicting saints who had earned their martyrdom through suffering so exquisite, the ecclesiarchy preserved it in bronze and marble. Now those statues wept, not metaphorically. The bronze ran like tears, liquid metal streaming from empty eye sockets to pool on stone already slick with fluids no sculptor had intended. The marble saints moved their poses shifting when no one watched directly. And from somewhere beneath the plaza, music rose. It sounded almost beautiful. Holt's tactical display painted the scene in clinical detail. Thermal scans showed 300 life signs clustered at the center of the plaza, their body temperatures elevated beyond sustainable levels. Psychic resonance meters screamed warnings in colors the Mechanicus had invented specifically to denote spiritual catastrophe. The warp boundary had grown thin enough here that standing in the plaza meant standing in two places at once, and neither location welcomed human presence. The cult stronghold. He spoke without looking away from the hololith projection. They've been using this site for 6 weeks. Rituals, sacrifices, whatever passes for worship when Slaanesh provides the liturgy. Bayonetta stood beside him at the tactical station, studying the data with interest that seemed both genuine and detached. Her Grey Knight escort maintained their positions 3 meters distant, close enough to execute termination protocols, far enough to suggest they had not yet decided whether such measures would prove necessary or merely fatal to the executioners. Music and martyrdom. She tapped the display where the psychic readings peaked. Very on brand. Let me guess, they think they're achieving transcendence through sensation, pushing past the limits of mortal experience to touch something divine. Corrupted heretics rarely articulate their delusions coherently. Vale's voice carried its usual flat certainty. They are lost. Cleansing through flame is the only mercy we can offer. How very pragmatic. Bayonetta's tone suggested she found the entire philosophy adorable in its brutality. But here's a thought. What if we don't just kill them? What if we cut the connection they're using as a lifeline? Holt turned toward her. Elaborate. They're not spontaneously generating corruption. They're channeling it. Becoming conduits for something on the other side of your cosmic scar. She gestured at the projection, and for a moment Holt saw it through different eyes. Saw the pattern beneath the chaos. Break the ritual. Disrupt the resonance. Make the connection too expensive to maintain, and whatever's feeding on them loses interest. And if disruption fails, then your flamethrowers get their moment to shine, and everyone goes home satisfied except the people turning into ash. The levity in her voice did not quite mask the calculation beneath. But my way, you might actually save some of them, assuming that matters to you. It did not. Holt had learned long ago that salvation was not part of his job description. His mandate extended to containment elimination and the prevention of cascade failures that consumed sectors instead of worlds. Individual lives factored into equations as resources or casualties, nothing more. But resources had value. And 300 souls, if purged of corruption, represented 300 witnesses to Imperial authority. 300 voices to spread the message that even in the darkness beyond the rift, the Emperor's servants still held the line. Propaganda had its uses. We move in 10 minutes. He pulled up forced disposition. Grey Knights would anchor the assault. Sororitas would provide fire support and secure the perimeter. And Bayonetta. You will accompany the primary strike force. Demonstrate your methods. If they prove effective, we proceed. If not, you've got enough firepower pointed at me to reduce this entire plaza to rubble, me included. She examined her nails in that maddening way she had, as if the conversation bored her slightly. I'm familiar with the concept of probationary cooperation, darling. You don't need to draw diagrams. Canoness Thorne emerged from the shadows where she had been monitoring the exchange. Her armor still bore scorch marks from the previous engagement, and she had refused the Mechanicus offer of repairs until the cathedral district was secured. Penance through discomfort. The Adepta Sororitas understood suffering as prayer. I will lead my sisters in the assault. No question in her voice. Statement of fact. Canoness. Holt kept his tone neutral. Your forces have taken heavy losses. Perhaps a support role. We have fought and bled on this world. while you consulted with abominations." Thorne's gaze fixed on Bayonetta with the intensity of someone staring at a personal insult made manifest. "We will not stand aside while witchcraft pretends to virtue." Bayonetta raised one hand in mock surrender. "Oh, I never claimed virtue. Just competence. There's a difference, though. I understand how that might be confusing." The temperature in the command post dropped several degrees. Holt intervened before theology could escalate into violence. "Canoness, your faith is noted and respected. Your sisters will hold the northern approach. Grey Knights take primary entry. Sister Superior Mordrin will coordinate flanking elements." He turned to Bayonetta. "You operate under Brother Captain Vale's direct observation. Any deviation results in immediate censure." "By censure, you mean execution." "I mean what I say." She offered that knowing expression again, the one that suggested she had already calculated 17 ways the engagement would unfold and found most of them tedious. "Understood, Inquisitor. I'll be on my best behavior. Which, fair warning, is still going to look deeply suspicious to anyone invested in orthodoxy." 10 minutes later, they stood at the plaza's edge. The music had grown louder. Not in volume, but in presence, as if sound itself had developed weight and texture. Holt could feel it pressing against his skin, could taste colors that had no business existing outside warp-touched nightmares. His Rosarius flickered its protective wards, activating automatically against the ambient corruption. The cultists moved in patterns at the plaza's center, not dancing, too deliberate for that. They flowed like water, like flesh, attempting to imitate liquid, and where they touched, the air rippled with wrongness. Their voices rose in harmony, singing words in languages that predated the Imperium's oldest records. Vale's strike force advanced in perfect formation. Power armor made no attempt at stealth. They were Grey Knights. They did not hide from demons. They announced their arrival and let the enemy contemplate fear in whatever passed for its final moments. Bayonetta walked among them like a discordant note in a martial hymn. Where they moved with synchronized precision, she strolled with casual grace. Where they radiated controlled fury, she projected amusement. The contrast was deliberate. Everything about her was deliberate. The cultists noticed. They turned as one, 300 faces swiveling with mechanical uniformity. Their eyes had gone the color of bruised sunset. Their mouths opened, and the song changed pitch. Holt felt reality lurch. The plaza folded. Not physically. Space remained consistent. But something else had shifted, some deeper geometry that underpinned the material world. The cultists began to move faster, their patterns accelerating into configurations that hurt to perceive directly. Vale raised his nemesis force sword. Psychic fire blazed along its edge wards, older than continents blazing to life. "In the Emperor's name you will be cleansed." The cultists laughed. Then Bayonetta moved. She did not run. Running implied urgency, and she demonstrated none. She stepped forward into the first rank of cultists, and time decided it had better things to do than maintain consistent flow. Which time? Holt had seen combat precognition before. Had watched psychers glimpse future permutations and adjust their present accordingly. This was not that. This was localized temporal dislocation reality, slowed to the speed of crystallized syrup. And Bayonetta walked through it, like a woman taking a pleasant evening stroll. The cultists moved like statues, pretending at motion. Their attacks crawled through air that had forgotten how to let things pass quickly. Bayonetta sidestepped a blade that would have taken her throat, her movement casual, almost bored. She raised one hand, fingers pointing in a gesture that suggested she was about to make a point in a particularly tedious argument. Guns emerged, not drawn. Manifested. 4 pistols, 2 in her hands, 2 attached to her heels in configurations that mocked physics. She fired, and the sound arrived before the trigger pulls bullets traveling through frozen time, to find targets that had not yet realized they were dead. When time resumed its normal pace, 6 cultists collapsed. Not wounded, erased. Their forms came apart like smoke sculptures meeting wind. The music stuttered. Vale's warriors surged forward, exploiting the disruption. Storm bolters roared, each round consecrated and blessed each impact, driving corruption back toward whatever hole it had crawled from. The canoness and her sisters advanced from the flanks, flamers painting the air with purifying fire. But the ritual would not break easily. At the plaza's center, something began to form. Not a physical presence. Not yet. A suggestion of shape, a possibility of existence, the outline of something that wanted very badly to become real. The cultists screamed in unison, their voices merging into a sound that bypassed ears entirely and went straight to the nerve endings. Bayonetta looked up at the forming manifestation, and her expression shifted. The playfulness evaporated, replaced by something colder. Professional. There you are. She spoke to the thing taking shape above the plaza. Took you long enough. The manifestation rippled. It had no mouth yet, but Holt heard its laughter, felt it. The sound carried promises of sensation beyond mortal comprehension. Pleasure and pain rendered indistinguishable experience refined, until it became addiction, and addiction elevated to divinity. Slaaneash's gift. The slow poison dressed as transcendence. Bayonetta raised both pistols and fired directly into the manifestation's core. The bullets did nothing. Passed through the forming shape like rain through fog. But that had not been the point, Brother Captain. Her voice cut through the chaos with absolute clarity. The resonance point. Center of the ritual formation. You see it. Vale's helm turned fractionally. Confirmed. On my mark, you hit it with everything that glows. I'll make sure they're too distracted to notice. She did not wait for confirmation. She moved again, and this time the display was not for efficiency. This time she made a statement. The transformation happened mid-stride. Her form blurred, shifted, and where a woman had been a massive shape, now lunged forward. Panther made of shadow and starlight, moving with speed that made her previous display look pedestrian. She tore through the cultist ranks, not killing but scattering, disrupting their formation, breaking the careful geometry they had maintained. The manifestation screamed. Tried to coalesce faster, to force its way into reality through sheer will and the faith of its worshippers. Vale saw the opening and took it. His brothers focused their fire on a single point, the exact center of the ritual circle, where the cultists' movements converged. Canons unleashed rounds that existed partially in the warp, specifically designed to wound demons in the space between real and unreal. The bombardment concentrated into one devastating strike, and the resonance point shattered. The effect was immediate. The manifestation convulsed. Its half-formed structure collapsed inward, pulling against the cultists who had given it shape. They fell screaming, their bodies suddenly remembering what physical laws demanded of flesh. The music died, cut off mid-note, and silence rushed in to fill the vacuum. Bayonetta shifted back to human form, landing lightly amid the carnage, not even breathing hard. Thorn advanced through the smoke and blood, her bolt pistol still raised. The survivors. They are tainted. They must be. They're broken. Bayonetta's interruption carried no heat. Just fact. The connection severed. Whatever they were channeling, it's gone now. They're just traumatized cultists experiencing withdrawal from cosmic horror. Dangerous, sure, but not corrupted. Not anymore. The canoness stared at her with something that might have been hatred, or might have been something more complex. You speak with certainty about matters of the soul. I speak with experience about matters of manipulation. Bayonetta's tone gentled fractionally. There's a difference between being twisted and being used. These people were tools, disposable conduits. The thing on the other side has already forgotten them. Holt surveyed the plaza. 300 cultists, now unconscious or catatonic. The ritual site broken, the manifestation dispersed, and his forces had taken minimal casualties. Unacceptable. By Imperial standards, this should have required orbital bombardment and a century of quarantine. Instead, they had surgical precision and salvageable assets. He activated his Vox. Medici teams forward. Containment protocols for survivors. Prepare psychic screening and penitent processing. He paused. Mark this location as cleansed but monitored. The ritual site remains compromised until further notice. Vale approached his armor bearing fresh scorch marks. The method was effective. High praise from a gray knight. Holt noted it. Bayonetta had already lost interest in the aftermath. She stood at the plaza's edge, looking up at the rift overhead. Even with the ritual broken, it continued to pulse, continued to spread its taint across the sky. Holt joined her. One site cleansed, 7 remain. 7 that you know about. She did not look at him. But this one was just a symptom. The real problem is still building, still organizing. And it's noticed you now. Noticed us? Oh, it noticed me the moment I arrived. That familiar amusement crept back into her voice. But now, it knows I'm interfering. Which means the next engagement won't be this easy. As if summoned by her words, the rift pulsed. Once. Twice. And from somewhere distant, something laughed. Not the cultists, not the manifestation they had dispersed. Something larger. Something that had watched the entire engagement with interest. Back at the command post, Holt reviewed the engagement recordings. Watched Bayonetta's display again, analyzed the temporal anomaly she had generated, studied how the disruption had propagated through the ritual structure. His data slate chirped. New casualty projections from the anchor site. The Psyker choir was degrading faster. 36 hours had become 28. The anchor would fail soon, and when it did, everything they had accomplished here would become irrelevant against the flood of corruption that would follow. He pulled up the remaining cult sites, marked them in descending priority, calculated engagement timelines. They could cleanse 3 more before the anchor collapsed. Maybe 4 if they moved without rest. It would not be enough, but it was what they had. Holt activated the Vox, began issuing new orders. Deploy to Site 2 within the hour. Maintain pressure. Keep moving. Behind him, displayed on the hololith, the rift continued to spread, and somewhere beyond it, something prepared its response. The anchor was screaming, not metaphorically. The machinery emitted a sound that bypassed mechanical acoustics entirely and resonated directly in the bones of anyone standing within its radius. The Psyker choir had been reduced to 7 functioning members. The others had expired during the night, their minds burning out like overloaded circuits as they channeled power beyond mortal capacity. The tech priests worked in frantic silence, their mechadendrites weaving through exposed components, while they chanted litanies that sounded increasingly like begging. One of them had begun to weep oil-thick black tears, streaming down a face that was more metal than flesh. Holt stood at the command station and watched his carefully constructed strategy collapse in real time. 26 hours. That was how long the anchor had left according to the latest projections, and those numbers degraded with each passing minute. They had cleansed 3 cult sites in rapid succession, moving from one engagement to the next with brutal efficiency. Bayonetta had proven her worth 3 times over her methods unconventional, but devastatingly effective. It did not matter. The rift had stopped being passive. It started with tremors. Not seismic. Spiritual. Reality itself developed a shudder, a barely perceptible vibration that made standing in one place feel like standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. Then came the lights. Phantasmal radiance bleeding through the sky in colors that had no names. Illumination that cast shadows in impossible directions. And then the boundary between worlds tore open. The breach manifested 3 kilometers from the anchor site, erupting like a wound that had been waiting for permission to bleed. Daimonettes poured through dozens, becoming hundreds, becoming a tide of claws and laughter and wrongness given form. They moved with grace that mocked human motion, their bodies expressing geometries that belonged to different physics entirely. Slaaneash's handmaidens, the lesser demons, the advanced scouts of excess. They were beautiful, and they were horror, and the distinction between those states had long since ceased to matter. Vale's warriors met them at the first defensive line. The Grey Knights fought like machines built specifically to kill gods. Each movement economical, each strike precisely calculated. Their nemesis weapons carved through demon flesh with efficiency that spoke to millennia of practice of an entire chapter. Dedicated to one purpose and one purpose alone. It was not enough. For every demon that fell screaming back into the warp, 2 more emerged from the breach. The defensive line held, but holding was not victory. It was just slower defeat. Thorn's surviving sisters anchored the flanks, their flamers painting the air with consecrated promethium. They sang hymns while they burned demons, their voices rising in perfect harmony, even as claws found gaps in their armor. 3 sisters fell in the first 5 minutes. They died without stopping their song. The Adepta Sororitas understood that faith without suffering was just noise. Bayonetta arrived at the front line, like someone showing up fashionably late to a party she had not particularly wanted to attend. Her Grey Knight escort followed at a distance that suggested they still had not determined whether she qualified as asset or liability. She surveyed the battlefield with an expression that managed to convey both assessment and mild disappointment. Well, someone's committed to making an entrance. She drew her pistols with movements too smooth to be entirely human. Though I'll be honest, the aesthetic is a bit repetitive. Claw's unnatural beauty promises of sensation beyond mortal ken. She fired twice, and 2 demonettes dissolved mid-leap. Seen it? Boring. A demon lunged at her from the left, moving faster than human perception should register. Bayonetta sidestepped without looking, her movement casual, as if she had simply decided to stand somewhere else and reality had accommodated. The demon's claws found empty air. Her heel found its throat. The gun mounted on her foot fired point blank. The demon came apart in a spray of essence that evaporated before hitting the ground. You'll have to do better than that, darlings. They tried. 3 demons attacked in concert. Their movements synchronized in ways that suggested shared consciousness. They came at her from different vectors, exploiting angles that should have left her no escape route. Witch time activated. The world turned to amber honey, everything flowing at glacial speeds. Bayonetta moved through the frozen moment like a dancer performing a routine she had memorized centuries ago. She placed bullets with surgical precision, each shot finding the exact vulnerable point where demon flesh cohered enough to be disrupted. Time resumed. 3 more demons screamed back into the warp. Vale fought 3 meters to her right, his force sword describing arcs of psychic fire through the demon tide. He did not acknowledge her display, did not need to. They were not allies. Just 2 weapons pointed at the same target. But the breach continued to expand. Holt watched from the command station, his tactical display painting the situation in brutal clarity. The demons were not attempting to overwhelm the defensive line. They were testing it, probing for weaknesses. And behind them, deeper within the breach, something larger was taking form. He activated the Vox. All units prepare for greater demon manifestation. Authorization granted for unrestricted ordnance. The response came in the form of heavy weapons fire. Less cannons carved lines of coherent light through demon flesh. Missile launchers painted the sky with contrails that ended in purifying explosions. The firepower would have reduced a fortress to rubble. It slowed the tide, barely. Bayonetta paused in her methodical destruction to assess the breach. Whatever she saw there made her posture shift, made the playfulness drain from her expression like water from a broken cup. Holt. She used his name without title, without formality. just direct address between two people who recognize the stakes. The thing coming through, it's not a standard manifestation. It's anchored. Someone on your world is serving as a host, giving it physical purchase. The Inquisitor's blood went cold. Identify the host. Working on it? Her gaze swept across the battlefield, reading patterns in the demon movements. It's close. Within the city, someone who volunteered, who invited this, someone who thinks they're achieving apotheosis, a cult leader, an adept who had drunk too deeply from forbidden knowledge, someone who had stared into Slaaneish's infinite hunger and mistaken it for love. Holt pulled up the remaining cult site data, cross-referenced with psychic resonance readings. Found the spike 3 kilometers south in what had been the Administratum district. Vale, we need to sever the host connection. The Grey Knight captain bisected a demon with movements that looked almost bored. The line will not hold without. The line is irrelevant if that manifestation achieves full materialization. Holt made the choice that defined command. The terrible mathematics of acceptable loss. Take the Umbra anomaly. Eliminate the host. I will maintain the perimeter. Vale did not question the order. Grey Knights were many things, but insubordinate was not among them. He carved a path through the demon tide with methodical violence, his brothers following in perfect formation. Bayonetta fell in beside him, her movements flowing between combat styles with fluid grace. Where he fought like a siege engine, she fought like a storm. Different methodologies, same result. Behind them, the defensive line buckled. Thorn saw the breach widen, saw more demons pouring through, and made a decision that surprised no one who knew her. She led her remaining sisters in a suicidal charge directly into the demon tide, their flamers blazing their hymns, rising to a crescendo that sounded like defiance made audible. They died buying seconds. Those seconds mattered. Holt watched them fall and felt nothing. Could afford to feel nothing. He had learned long ago that grief was a luxury paid for with other people's blood, and his accounts were already overdrawn. He activated the anchor's auxiliary systems, pushed power beyond recommended thresholds. The Psyker choir screamed as the draw intensified their minds. Burning faster, their lives converted into fuel for a machine that cared nothing for suffering. The anchor field strengthened. Not much. Enough. The demon tide struck the reinforced boundary and found resistance where moments before there had been yielding. They shrieked in frustration, in rage, in something that might have been disappointment. Vale's strike force reached the Administratum district in 4 minutes. The building they sought had once housed bureaucrats who processed tithes and administered imperial law with the passionate enthusiasm of people who understood that paperwork was how empires actually functioned. Now it housed something else. The host sat in what had been the governor's office, surrounded by concentric circles of still-living cultists. They had carved the symbols into their own flesh, had written invitations in languages that predated human speech. And in the center of it all, the host waited. She had been beautiful once. Perhaps still was in the way that fire was beautiful. Her form had begun to shift to accommodate the thing wearing her as a skin. Wings pressed against her shoulders from the inside, trying to emerge. Her eyes held depths that belonged to something vast and hungry. She turned toward the strike force, and recognition flickered across features not entirely her own. "You brought me a gift." The voice emerged layered, multiple frequencies overlapping. How thoughtful. Bayonetta stepped forward, and the temperature in the room dropped. "Let me guess. You think you're special? Think you've been chosen for transcendence? Think that thing crawling into your skull is salvation?" The host thing laughed. "I have touched infinity. I have seen pleasure beyond mortality. What are you compared to?" "Bored. I'm very bored." Bayonetta's tone could have frozen hydrogen. "See, here's what you don't understand. That thing you're channeling, it doesn't love you. It doesn't even like you. You're just convenient. a doorway it can walk through. And the moment it's done, you'll be discarded like every other tool that outlived its usefulness. The manifestation rippled. Anger touched those borrowed features. You speak from ignorance, I speak from experience, sweetheart. Bayonetta raised both pistols. I've dealt with entities that make your passenger look like amateur hour. And here's what I learned. They can be hurt. They can be driven back. They can be made to understand that some doors stay closed. She fired, not at the host, at the ritual circles, at the cultists maintaining the connection. The bullets found targets with impossible precision, each impact disrupting the careful geometry that anchored the manifestation to physical reality. Vale and his brothers followed her lead, their weapons painting the room with psychic fire. The cultists fell their deaths, severing connections one by one. The manifestation screamed, tried to force its way through completely to tear free of the dying host and exist purely on rage and stolen essence. Bayonetta would not permit it. She moved in witch time, her form blurring through frozen moments. She placed shots that struck the manifestation directly, not killing, but constraining, forcing it back into the spaces between real and unreal. Each bullet was a word in a conversation conducted through violence. Each impact said the same thing. No, not here, not now, not ever. The manifestation recognized her. Not her specifically, but her nature. Another thing that walked between worlds that existed in defiance of simple categories. And it understood in the way that predators understand other predators that this was not prey. It retreated, not because it was beaten, because continuing would cost more than victory was worth. The host collapsed the manifestation's withdrawal, leaving her body empty. She would live, perhaps. But what lived would not be the person who had invited corruption in. That individual had died the moment she opened the door. Some choices could not be unmade. Vale's helm turned toward Bayonetta. The connection is severed. For now, she holstered her weapons. But that was just a probe, a test to see how we'd respond. The real assault is still building. They returned to find the defensive line holding by threads and willpower. Thorn had fallen, her armor breached in a dozen places, her flamers empty. She lived barely, her breathing shallow but steady. Around her, her sisters' bodies formed a wall of the faithful dead. The demon tide had receded when the manifestation retreated. The lesser demons returning to the warp, in absence of a greater will to direct them. The breach remained open, but dormant, watching. Holt met them at the perimeter. His armor bore fresh scars. His Rosarius had cracked its wards, depleted from sustained exposure to corruption. Status: host eliminated. Manifestation forced back. Vale's report arrived with mechanical precision. Casualties: 40% of defensive forces. Anchor integrity at 18%. Psyker choir reduced to 4 functioning members. The numbers told the story. They had won this engagement. They were losing the war. Holt pulled up the revised projections. The anchor would fail within 12 hours, possibly less. And when it failed, everything they had accomplished would become irrelevant against the full weight of what waited beyond the rift. He looked at Bayonetta, who stood amid the carnage, with her usual expression of amused detachment firmly back in place. This is what you meant when you said it would get harder. Oh, this wasn't even hard yet, darling. She gestured at the rift overhead. This was foreplay. The actual performance hasn't started. As if in response, the breach pulsed. Once, twice, and from somewhere beyond the veil, something that had been watching the entire engagement with interest began to laugh. Not the manifestation they had driven back. Something larger. Something that had let them win because watching them struggle was so much more entertaining than simply crushing them. Slayanesh's attention had fully arrived on Enoch 9, and the Prince of Excess was not known for restraint. The dream started during what passed for night on Enoch 9, not sleep. No one slept anymore, not with the rift bleeding madness across the sky, and the anchor's scream drilling into bone marrow. But the human mind required rest, demanded moments of reduced consciousness, even when consciousness itself had become a liability. So they rested in shifts, and in those vulnerable hours, the whispers found them. Holt felt it first as a warmth. Pleasant. Almost comforting. The sensation of standing in sunlight after years of cold, of hearing laughter after decades of screams. His mind, trained to recognize corruption in all its forms, tried to reject the feeling. Tried to activate the mental disciplines that had kept him functional through 30 years of hunting demons. The warmth persisted, grew stronger, and with it came a voice. Not words, not yet. Just the suggestion of communication, the promise that if he listened carefully enough, profound truths would reveal themselves. Secrets that would make sense of the suffering. Patterns that would justify the losses. He forced his eyes open. Found himself standing in the command post, his hand resting on the tactical display. How long had he been standing there? Minutes, hours? The chronometer said 3 hours had passed, but his memory held only fragments. The tech priest on duty had not moved, had not noticed. The servitors continued their mindless maintenance routines. Everything appeared normal, except the tactical display showed patterns that should not exist. Symbols he had not input, geometries that hurt to perceive directly, all of them, forming a message in a language older than the Imperium. It said, "We see you." Holt purged the display with shaking hands. Vale found him 10 minutes later, standing in the ablution chamber, scrubbing his face with water, cold enough to ache. The Grey Knight captain said nothing, just stood in the doorway with that eternal, armored patience waiting. "It touched me." Holt's voice came out flat, statement of fact. During the rest cycle, Slanesh's attention, I felt it. Corruption index, 0. My Rosarius detected nothing. The taint didn't enter, it just... He struggled for words that could describe the experience. Observed. Like someone looking through a window, noting what they saw, filing it away for later use. Vale's helm tilted fractionally. "You should submit to psychic screening." "I should?" Holt met his own reflection in the mirror. Saw someone who had been making terrible choices for so long they had started to feel like wisdom. But we don't have time for protocols. The anchor fails in 9 hours. Screening takes 6. Do the math, brother captain. Then I will assign. You'll do nothing. Holt turned to face him directly. "Because whatever just touched me has touched everyone in this installation. And pretending we can quarantine the problem is fantasy." He was right. They both knew it. The whispers had spread through the command structure, like smoke through cracks. Tech priests reported experiencing unusual sensory input. Servitors developed behavioral anomalies that suggested awareness beyond their programming. And the remaining psyker choir, those 4 souls still burning themselves to fuel the anchor, had begun to weep tears that tasted of honey. The assault was not coming from outside anymore. It was already inside. Had been inside from the moment they erected the anchor and declared this space defended. Because Slanesh did not respect wall, did not acknowledge boundaries between permitted and forbidden. The Prince of Excess existed in the space between desire and restraint, and everyone present desired something, even if that something was just the end of suffering. Bayonetta had not slept, had not tried. She stood at the anchor's perimeter, studying the machinery with an expression that suggested professional interest mixed with aesthetic disapproval. The Grey Knights assigned to monitor her maintained their distance, but even they had begun to show signs of strain. One of them kept adjusting his gauntlet, the same motion repeated every 30 seconds. Obsessive, compulsive. She noticed everything and said nothing. When Holt approached, she spoke without turning. "It's in the air now. The corruption. Not physical, conceptual. It's rewriting what people think is normal, adjusting their baseline for acceptable until the unacceptable starts looking reasonable. Can it be countered? Depends on the person. She finally turned to face him. Some people have strong enough sense of self to recognize when something external is pushing. Others, she gestured vaguely. Others just assume their thoughts are their own and ride the spiral down. Which are you? Her expression shifted. Not quite amusement. Something sharper. Darling, I've had entities tried to rewrite my reality since before your Imperium learned to count to 3. I know what it feels like when something's in my head uninvited. She paused. The question is whether you know. Before Holt could respond, the anchor shrieked, not the usual mechanical scream. This was different. Worse. The sound carried harmonics that should not exist outside warp space frequencies that made reality uncomfortable. The Psyker choir convulsed in their restraint thrones, their backs arching, their mouths opening in silent screams. And then the breach opened, not outside, inside. Within the anchor's protective field, in the space that was supposed to be hardened against warp incursion. A tear in local reality, small at first, then spreading like a wound that refused to clot. Through it came a presence, not a demon, not physical. This was pure attention consciousness without form. Awareness focused with the intensity of a star, compressed to singularity. It filled the space around the anchor, like perfume, like poison, like something that existed in the gap between pleasure and pain. Everyone within the installation felt it arrive, felt their thoughts adjust, their perceptions shift, their certainties become negotiable. Holt reached for his Rosarius, found it inert. The wards had failed. Or perhaps they had never been designed to protect against this. Against something that did not attack, but invited. Did not corrupt, but seduced. The presence spoke, not in words. In sensations. In promises made directly to the parts of consciousness that existed below language. It offered each person exactly what they had stopped admitting they wanted. Rest for the exhausted. Purpose for the lost. Beauty for those who had stared at horror so long they had forgotten anything else existed. It offered Holt an end to the choices. An escape from the mathematics of acceptable loss. A world where he would not have to calculate which lives mattered and which could be spent like currency. All he had to do was stop resisting. Just relax, just accept. Just let the pleasure wash away the pain. The presence turned its attention to Bayonetta. The temperature around her dropped 10 degrees in an instant. She stood perfectly still. Her posture unchanged, but something in the air had shifted. Where moments before there had been a woman, now there existed a point of absolute refusal. A hard surface against which the presence's invitation broke like water against stone. It studied her, curious, intrigued, and then it spoke to her specifically in a way it had not spoken to the others. Not an invitation. A conversation between equals who recognized each other across the gulf between different kinds of power. The words manifested as sensation, as color, as concepts too complex for simple language. It showed her a vision, a stage, infinite, perfect, where every movement was performance, every action was art, where style and substance merged into something transcendent. A place where she would never be diminished, never be reduced, never be anything less than the absolute pinnacle of what she was. All she had to do was accept the patronage, join the endless celebration, become one of the chosen who danced in Slanesh's court and experienced existence refined to its most exquisite edge. Bayonetta looked at the vision, considered it, and laughed. Not nervous laughter, not deflection. Pure, genuine amusement at a joke so obvious it barely qualified as an attempt. Oh, sweetheart. She spoke to the presence as if addressing a child who had tried to sell her something she already owned. You really don't understand, do you? The presence rippled. Confusion, perhaps offense. You're offering me perfection, eternal performance, a stage where I'd never have to stop being magnificent. Her tone carried something between pity and contempt. But here's the thing you don't grasp. I already have that. I already am that. I don't need your permission to be perfect. I don't need your stage to perform. I don't need anything from you except maybe better material. She took a step forward toward the breach, and the presence recoiled. The difference between us, darling, is control. You offer excess without restraint, pleasure without choice. You turn people into instruments and call it ascension. But she gestured at herself, the motion encompassing everything she was. I choose my excess. I direct my pleasure. I decide when to perform and when to stop. And that's what terrifies you. Because choice is the one thing you can't replicate. The one thing your infinite celebration lacks. The presence tried a different approach. Showed her the alternative. Showed her grinding down under the weight of service to others. Showed her becoming a tool for the Imperium, just another weapon to be expended. Showed her what awaited if she continued to resist what it offered. Bayonetta's response was a single raised eyebrow. You think being used is my fear, that I'm worried about becoming someone's instrument? She shook her head. Everyone uses everyone, darling. That's just reality. The question is whether you know you're being used and choose it anyway. Whether you maintain agency in the transaction. Her expression hardened. You don't offer agency. You offer surrender dressed up as liberation, and I don't do surrender. Around the installation, people began to surface from the seduction's grip. Not all of them, not even most, but enough. Those who heard Bayonetta's rejection and recognized in it a framework for their own resistance. Those who remembered that faith was supposed to be chosen, not imposed. Those who understood that the Emperor's service was difficult precisely because it demanded will rather than accepting automation. The presence withdrew slightly, not defeated, not even particularly discouraged, but reassessing, adjusting its approach. It had expected corruption, expected temptation to work through the usual channels of desire and desperation. It had not expected someone who understood its language and found it boring. Holt felt the pressure ease, not vanish, just recede to manageable levels. He activated his Vox with hands that had stopped shaking. All stations report status. The responses came in fragmented, confused, but functional. The installation had survived the first direct psychic assault. Barely. Vale approached from the inner sanctum, his armor scorched in places where the presence's attention had focused too intensely. 4 tech priests succumbed. 2 servitors suffered catastrophic neural cascade. The psyker choir, he paused. 3 remain. The 4th achieved transcendence during the assault. A polite way of saying the 4th had been consumed by what they channeled. Holt pulled up the anchor's status. Critical failure in 6 hours, maybe less. And the presence had not given up, had not retreated beyond the veil. It remained hovering at the edge of perception, watching, waiting, learning. It will try again. Bayonetta spoke from her position near the breach, which had begun to seal, now that the presence's direct attention had shifted elsewhere. Different approach next time. More subtle. It knows brute force won't work, so it'll try precision. Find the weak points, the vulnerable moments. Then we shore up defenses. No. She cut him off. You can't defend against this. Defense is reactive. You need to be proactive, need to hit whatever's anchoring its manifestation before it gets organized enough to try a real assault. Holt understood what she meant. The cult's central temple, the primary ritual site, where all roads lead. She turned to face him fully. It's been building towards something, preparing a grand gesture. And when that gesture completes, your anchor fails, or won't matter because the entire planet becomes a stage for something much worse. You propose an assault. I propose we stop playing defense and start making life difficult for things that think this world belongs to them. Vale joined them, his posture radiating skepticism. The central temple is 5 kilometers into corrupted territory. Our forces are depleted. The anchor barely maintains integrity. A deep strike operation is strategically unsound. So is waiting here until reality collapses. Bayonetta's tone remained light, but her eyes were cold. You want sound strategy retreat. Evacuate. Call for exterminatus and turn this planet into a monument to acceptable losses. She paused. But you're not going to do that, because Inquisitor Holt here doesn't retreat. He makes terrible choices and calls them necessary, which, to be fair, they usually are. Holt met her gaze and recognized the challenge. The dare. The implicit question of whether he would commit to the desperate gambit or acknowledge the limits of his authority. He made his choice, the only choice that mattered. Brother Captain, assemble your remaining warriors. Canoness Thorn, if she can stand, and any sisters still capable of combat. He activated the tactical display, began plotting assault vectors. We move on the central temple in 2 hours. Kill team composition. Maximum violence, minimum exposure. And the anchor, Vale's question carried no judgment, just tactical necessity. Hold with minimal garrison. If we fail, the anchor's fate becomes irrelevant. Holt began issuing specific orders, each one a calculation in blood and desperation. If we succeed, we buy enough time to evacuate assets and call the strike. Bayonetta's expression shifted to something that might have been approval. There's hope for you yet, Inquisitor. Terrible, doomed, absolutely suicidal hope, but hope nonetheless. The presence still watching from beyond the veil began to laugh. It had wanted them to come to the temple, had wanted them to commit their forces, had wanted them to walk willingly into the performance. It had been orchestrating since the moment the rift opened, and now they would. Because sometimes in a war against gods, the only winning move was to play the game better than divinity expected mortals could. The anchor's scream intensified. 6 hours to failure. 6 hours to storm a temple defended by demons and cultists who no longer remembered being human. 6 hours to kill whatever waited at the center of Slaaneş's attention. Holt looked at his remaining forces, looked at Bayonetta, who stood ready with that eternal confidence, looked at Vale, who would follow orders unto death, because that was what Grey Knights did. He had made worse gambles. The lie came easier each time he told it. Canoness Preceptor Lysenia Thorn had been dying for 3 hours and refused to acknowledge it. Her armor's medical systems screamed warnings that her augmetic overrides silenced with practiced efficiency. 7 major wounds, 3 of which qualified as fatal under any reasonable medical assessment. Her left lung had collapsed. Her right kidney had been shredded by demon claws. Blood loss exceeded sustainable parameters by 40%. She stood in the armory, checking her weapons, preparing for the assault on the central temple. A sister hospitaller tried to intervene, tried to explain that movement would accelerate her death, that she needed immediate surgery, that faith was not a substitute for functional organs. Thorn dismissed her with a look. The Emperor did not require her to survive. He required her to serve. And service meant standing while enemies remained. Meant fighting while breath persisted. Meant bearing witness through action that faith was not contingent on comfort or safety, or the weak luxury of self-preservation. She would serve until she fell. And if she fell during the assault, her last sight would be of heretics burning. That was enough. Holt found her in the cathedral's nave, kneeling before the altar, in what might have been prayer, or might have been the only position where her wounds hurt less. Blood had soaked through the seals in her armor, pooling on stone that had absorbed so much suffering it no longer showed stains. Canoness, you're unfit for combat. She did not turn. Inquisitor, you ally with witches and demons. Who are you to lecture on fitness? The words carried no heat. Just exhaustion and conviction in equal measure. Holt sat on the pew behind her, not kneeling. He had stopped pretending to pray decades ago. She is neither witch nor demon. The Grey Knights confirm this. She registers no corruption, no possession, no classification in your taxonomies of horror. Thorn finally looked at him, and her face was bone-pale beneath the grime. Because your Ordo has spent so long cataloging evil that you've forgotten how to recognize it when it wears a pleasant face. Then what is she in your assessment? Thorn was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone articulating a truth they wished was not true. Damned, but not fallen. She gestured vaguely with one hand. She walks in the company of things that should not be. She commands power that smells of the warp but tastes of something else. Something older. Something that predates the Emperor's light. Her breathing rattled. And she does it without shame, without repentance, as if such associations were natural. You fear her. I fear what she represents. Thorn's gaze fixed on the altar. A world where faith is negotiable, where power can be wielded without submission to righteous authority, where an individual can stand against gods and laugh at them. She paused. It makes everything I've sacrificed seem insufficient. Holt understood then. The hostility was not about corruption or heresy. It was about confronting someone who had found an answer to cosmic horror that did not require martyrdom or institutional blessing. Someone who fought demons and remained herself unbroken by the weight of necessity. It made the Adepta Sororitas' entire philosophy look like elaborate self-harm. The assault launches in 90 minutes. I need every capable warrior. He kept his tone neutral. But if you fall before we engage, your death serves nothing. My death serves as witness. Thorn rose, and the motion cost her visible effort. The Emperor watches all his servants. Even in failure, faith has value. Faith without survival is just corpses pretending at transcendence. She actually laughed. Brief, sharp, pained. You sound like her, the witch. That same pragmatism that mistakes cynicism for wisdom. She checked her bolt pistol's ammunition. But I will accompany the assault, Inquisitor. Not because you ordered it. Because I will not let heresy go unpunished while I yet draw breath. Holt watched her limp toward the armory and made a note in his tactical log. Thorn would not survive the assault. But she would buy time with her death. And time was the only currency that mattered now. He found Bayonetta on the cathedral's rooftop, looking out over the city's corpse. The rift dominated the sky larger than it had been at their arrival. Its edges bleeding colors that had no names in Gothic or any other human language. Demon light cast everything in shades that suggested reality was negotiable. She heard him approach, but did not turn. Your canoness is going to die, you know. I'm aware, and you're going to let her. Yes. Bayonetta finally looked at him. You're a cold bastard Inquisitor. I respect that. But there's a difference between pragmatism and just not caring. I care. Holt kept his voice level. I care that if I pull her from the roster, her remaining sisters lose faith in the mission. I care that morale is already fragile. I care that sometimes letting someone die on their terms is the kindest option available. He paused. And I care that her sacrifice properly leveraged will buy us the opening we need. Using her death as tactical advantage. Something flickered in Bayonetta's expression. Not quite disapproval. That's admirably terrible. That's command. They stood in silence while the city burned in slow motion. Fires that had been raging for weeks had achieved a kind of equilibrium, consuming what remained at a sustainable rate. Somewhere in the distance, Cultists sang praises to entities that did not love them back. She hates me. Bayonetta spoke conversationally, not personally. She hates what I am, what I represent. And what do you represent? Choice without consequence. Power without submission. The suggestion that maybe faith isn't the only way to stay human in a universe designed to break humanity. She leaned against the parapet. That's what terrifies her. The possibility that her entire life of suffering was optional. That she could have been strong without being broken first. Could she? We'll never know. Bayonetta's tone carried something that might have been regret. She made her choices long before I arrived, and now those choices are killing her. But they're her choices. I respect that, even when I think they're stupid. Vale emerged from the stairwell, his armor bearing fresh consecrations from the chapter's chaplain. The Grey Knights prepared for every mission as if it were their last. Often it was. Strike force assembled, awaiting your command. Holt pulled up the tactical display on his slate. The central temple sat 5 kilometers deep in corrupted territory. Direct approach was suicide. Stealth infiltration was impossible with demon sight pervading the area, which left only one option: maximum aggression. Full commitment. Hit the temple so hard and fast that response became impossible. We have 4 hours before anchor failure. He began highlighting approach vectors. Cathedral-class Thunderhawk will provide initial insertion. Combat drop directly into the temple plaza. Grey Knights establish perimeter. Sororitas provide suppressive fire. Our asset... He gestured at Bayonetta, who had begun examining her fingernails with theatrical disinterest. Engages the primary target while we handle the secondary threats. The primary target being... Vale's question carried professional interest. Whatever's conducting the ritual at the temple's heart. Whatever's been orchestrating this entire siege. Holt zoomed the display to show the temple's central chamber. We kill it. We disrupt the ritual. We get out before the building collapses on us. Simple. Bayonetta's tone was dry. Direct. Absolutely guaranteed to go wrong in interesting ways. I'm almost impressed. You have objections? Just observations? She pushed away from the parapet. That thing waiting for us isn't going to be alone. It's had weeks to prepare. It knows we're coming. And it's been fed by every atrocity committed on this world since the rift opened. She met his gaze. We're not walking into a ritual. We're walking into a trap. I know, and you're doing it anyway. Yes. She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right then. Let's go spring the trap. At least it won't be boring. The strike force assembled in the cathedral's landing bay. 40 Grey Knights, 12 Adepta Sororitas, including Thorn, 20 combat specialists from the inquisitorial contingent, and Bayonetta standing slightly apart, her posture radiating confidence that seemed almost offensive, surrounded by warriors preparing for martyrdom. Holt addressed them without ceremony. Speeches were for people who had time. The central temple is the source. We kill the source, we cut the corruption's deepest root. He pulled up the tactical overlay. Expect heavy resistance. Expect demons. Expect cultists who have forgotten they were human. Give them no quarter. Offer no mercy. This is not an operation. This is a purge. The warriors acknowledged with grim satisfaction. They understood this language. This was the work they had trained for the purpose that justified their existence. Only Thorn seemed uncertain. She stood at the formation's edge, one hand pressed to her side where blood had begun seeping through the armor's seals again. But when Holt met her gaze, she straightened, nodded once. She would serve. She would stand. She would bear witness. That was all faith required. The Thunderhawk's engines screamed to life. The warriors loaded with practiced efficiency. Holt took his position near the cockpit, monitoring tactical displays as the city spread beneath them like a diagram of damnation. Bayonetta settled into a restraint harness with obvious distaste. You know where I'm from. We have vehicles that don't sound like they're in existential agony. Where you're from doesn't have to contend with demon-infested airspace. Fair point. The Thunderhawk lifted, and the cathedral fell away beneath them. The flight would take 8 minutes. 8 minutes during which every demon in the city would sense their passage and converge on their destination. 8 minutes to commit fully to a course of action that would either save the world or doom it. Holt activated the Vox, connected to the anchor installation, received the status update he had been dreading. 3 hours to failure, maybe less. The Psyker choir was down to 2. The machinery was running on overrides and prayers in equal measure. If they failed at the temple, the anchor's death would become academic. He watched the city pass beneath them. Saw the temple ahead, its architecture warped by years of corruption into something that hurt to perceive directly. Saw the masses of cultists gathered in its plaza, their forms twisted by gifts they had mistaken for blessings. Saw the thing waiting at the temple's heart, massive and patient and ready. 30 seconds to drop. The pilot's voice crackled through the Vox. Emperor, guide your aim. The warriors readied weapons, activated wards, made their peace with whatever gods they acknowledged. Bayonetta cracked her neck, rolled her shoulders, checked her pistols with movements so practiced they looked like meditation. Ready for this? Holt asked her. She offered that infuriating expression, the one that suggested she had already seen how this would end and found it moderately entertaining. Darling, I was born ready. The question is whether your faith can keep up with my style. The Thunderhawk's rear ramp opened. Wind screamed through the bay. Below, the temple waited. Drop in 5, the pilot announced. 4, 3. Thorn whispered a prayer that no one heard over the engines. Vale activated his nemesis blade. Psychic fire blazed along its edge. Bayonetta holstered her pistols. When they hit the ground, she would need her hands free. 2, 1, drop. They fell like the Emperor's wrath made manifest. And in the temple's depths, something that had been waiting for this moment began to laugh. The temple had been beautiful once. Before the corruption, before the rituals, before the architects who built it realized their design had accidentally incorporated geometries that resonated with frequencies the warp found appealing. Now it was a monument to what happened when faith met obsession and forgot the difference. They hit the plaza in a combat drop that would have killed unaugmented humans. Grey Knights landed in perfect formation, their armor absorbing impact that should have shattered bone. Sororitas touched down with flamers, already igniting consecrated promethium, painting the air with purifying fire. Inquisitorial specialists established firing positions with mechanical efficiency. Bayonetta landed like someone stepping off a curb. Casual, unbothered. Her heels struck stone with a sound that should not have carried over the chaos, but somehow did. The cultists swarmed immediately, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They poured from the temple's entrances like water from a broken dam. Their forms warped by gifts, they had begged for their voices raised in hymns to entities that did not love them. They moved with coordinated precision that suggested individual thought had become collective madness. Vale's warriors met them with stormbolter fire. Each round a prayer. Each detonation a benediction. The Grey Knights advanced through the tide like reapers through wheat, their nemesis weapons carving paths through demon flesh and corrupted humanity without distinction. Because there was no distinction anymore. The cultists had become extensions of something larger. Puppets with the strings visible, but the hands controlling them hidden in spaces human perception could not map. Thorn led her sisters in a flanking maneuver that cost her visible effort. Blood had begun seeping through multiple armor seals. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, but her aim remained steady. Her faith remained absolute. She burned heretics with the methodical efficiency of someone who had made peace with dying and decided to make it count. Bayonetta moved through the chaos like she was choreographing a performance piece. Witch time flickered on and off, temporal bubbles forming around her as she exploited the gaps between seconds. Cultists lunged at positions she had already vacated. Their attacks found empty air while her bullets found vital targets with surgical precision. She was not fighting. She was demonstrating. Showing these twisted things that thought themselves chosen what actual excellence looked like. The plaza became an abattoir. Bodies piled in configurations that suggested the dead were more useful as obstacles than the living had been as warriors. Blood ran in channels carved by ancient drainage systems that had never been designed to handle this volume. Holt monitored from his position near the Thunderhawk, coordinating fire support and tracking the anchor's status on his slate. 2 hours, 40 minutes to failure. The Psyker choir was burning out faster than projected. Reality around the anchor's site had begun to develop visible cracks. They needed to finish this. Needed to kill whatever waited in the temple's heart before the anchor collapsed and turned their victory Pyrrhic. "Breach the entrance," he commanded. "All units converge on central chamber." The temple doors stood 3 stories tall, carved from stone that predated the Imperium by millennia. Wards had been etched into their surface-protective hexagrammatic patterns, designed to keep corruption out. They had been inverted, recarved, turned into invitations instead of barriers. Vale and 3 of his brothers placed shaped charges at the door's structural weak points. The explosives were not standard ordnance. They had been blessed by the chapter's most senior chaplain, consecrated through rituals that took 6 hours and required the sacrifice of 3 sanctified candles. They detonated with a sound like reality tearing. The doors collapsed inward, and what spilled out was not smoke or debris. It was sensation made manifest. Colors that existed in spectrums human eyes were not designed to process. Sounds that bypassed hearing and went straight to the nerve endings. The air itself developed taste and texture, became something that could be touched and consumed and weaponized. 3 inquisitorial specialists succumbed immediately. Their minds simply stopped processing input, overloaded by stimuli that exceeded biological tolerances. They collapsed, screaming, clawing at faces that had begun to register pleasure and pain as identical sensations. Bayonetta walked through it without flinching. "Amateurs," she muttered and kept moving. The interior of the temple was worse than the exterior. Space had stopped behaving consistently. Walls met at angles that should not exist in 3 dimensions. Gravity operated on negotiable principles. The floor was simultaneously horizontal and vertical, depending on which direction you faced. And at the center, in a chamber that was somehow both enormous and claustrophobic, it waited. The mask of perfect indulgence. Not a demon. Not exactly. It had been human once. A conductor according to the records Holt had accessed. A maestro who had achieved planetary recognition for performances that moved audiences to tears. Who had believed that art was the highest calling. Who had wanted to create beauty so transcendent it would outlive mortality. Slaanesh had heard that desire and answered. Now the conductor stood at the ritual's center, its form stretched and refined until it existed as pure aesthetic expression. It had too many limbs, too many faces, too many mouths singing in harmony that should have been impossible for a single entity to produce. It had become the performance, the eternal crescendo, the moment of perfection frozen and sustained forever. And it was dying. The effort of maintaining the ritual, of holding the breach open, of conducting the symphony of corruption across an entire world had pushed it past sustainable thresholds. It was burning itself out in pursuit of transcendence, consuming its own essence to fuel the display. It would succeed, would bring Slaanesh fully into real space through the rift it had carefully nurtured. Would turn Enoch 9 into a permanent wound where the material and immaterial merged. It just needed a few more hours. Well, Bayonetta's voice cut through the impossible acoustics. That's certainly a choice you've made. The mask turned its attention toward her. Recognition flickered across features that could not decide which face to present. Sister. Its voice emerged from multiple throats simultaneously. You understand? You who walk between worlds? You who perform without shame? Join the chorus, become part of something eternal. Hard pass, sweetheart. She raised her pistols. See, I've dealt with your type before. Entities that think performance is the same as existence. That confuse attention with love. That believe if they just show off hard enough, someone will finally say they're good enough. The mask rippled. Hurt. Actual hurt. You mock what you do not comprehend. I comprehend perfectly. Bayonetta's tone went cold. You wanted to be special. Wanted to matter. Wanted to create something that would outlast you. So when something offered you eternity in exchange for your humanity, you took the deal. She stepped forward. But here's the truth. You're too far gone to recognize. You're not eternal. You're just repeating the same moment over and over, mistaking stagnation for perfection. And that's the saddest thing I've seen all week. The mask screamed, not in anger, in recognition, in the awful realization that someone had finally articulated the truth it had been fleeing from. It attacked. The assault came not through physical violence, but through conceptual pressure. The mask tried to rewrite local reality to make its artistic vision so overwhelming that existence itself would conform to the performance. It pulled power from the ritual, from the cultists, still feeding it from the breach overhead that pulsed in time with its heartbeats. Vale and his warriors formed a ward line, their psychic disciplines creating a bulwark against the metaphysical assault. They held the space stable through sheer force of will and 10,000 years of accumulated demon-killing experience. Thorn and her sisters provided supporting fire, their weapons consecrated to harm things that should not exist. 3 sisters fell in the first minute their armor breached by attacks that came from directions shields could not block. Thorn did not fall, would not fall, not yet. Bayonetta moved forward into the storm. Witch time activated, and the assault slowed to manageable speeds. She walked through impossible attacks, sidestepping strikes that came from angles that did not exist, her movements economical and precise. She fired, and her bullets found targets that had been metaphysical concepts seconds before. The mask tried to seduce her, tried to show her visions of eternal performance, of stages that never ended, of audiences that would never stop applauding. She had already rejected better offers. You want to know the difference between us? She was close now, within the ritual's innermost circle. I perform because I choose to. You perform because you don't know how to stop. And that's not transcendence. That's just addiction with better aesthetics. She holstered her pistols, drew on power she had been holding in reserve. Power that made the Grey Knight's wards flicker. Power that came from places the Imperium had no names for. Wicked weaves, massive demonic limbs manifested around her, extensions of entities she had bound through contracts written before the Imperium's founding. They struck the mask with force that transcended merely physical, hitting it on levels where form and concept merged. The mask shattered, not died, shattered. Its carefully maintained perfection broke apart into component obsessions, into the individual desires that had been welded together into something that called itself whole. The ritual collapsed. The breach overhead convulsed its edges, beginning to seal, as the anchor that had been holding it open suddenly vanished. Cultists throughout the city fell screaming as the connection they had been sustaining severed all at once. And in the spaces between worlds, something vast took notice. Slanesh's attention focused fully on the temple, on the ritual's ruins, on the woman who had just destroyed weeks of careful orchestration. For one terrible moment, Bayonetta felt the full weight of a god's regard. It was not anger. Slanesh did not do anger. It was interest, curiosity. the recognition that something genuinely novel had occurred, that entertainment had been provided through defiance rather than submission. The Prince of Excess did not punish novelty, it rewarded it. The offer came not in words, but in pure sensation. Power beyond imagining, freedom from restraint, a place in the eternal celebration where her will would never be diminished, never be reduced, never be anything less than absolute. All she had to do was accept. Bayonetta felt the offer, understood it completely, and turned it down without hesitation. "Thanks, but I'm busy." She spoke to a god with the tone of someone declining a dinner invitation. "And your aesthetic really isn't my style. Too much excess, not enough control." The attention withdrew, not in anger, in something that might have been disappointment or might have been amusement. Slaanesh did not love, did not hate, but it appreciated those who maintained their nature even under pressure. It would remember her, would watch for her, would be ready if she ever changed her mind. She would not change her mind. The temple began to collapse, not from structural damage, from the sudden absence of the forces that had been holding it in configurations physics did not naturally support. Walls remembered they were supposed to meet at right angles. Gravity remembered its job. Space stopped negotiating. Extraction, now. Holt's command cut through the Vox with absolute authority. The warriors retreated in disciplined formation, covering each other's withdrawal with practiced efficiency. They left the dead where they fell. The Emperor would remember them. That was sufficient. Thorn had not moved. Could not move. Her wounds had finally exceeded her body's capacity to compensate. She knelt in the center of the collapsing temple, her flamers empty, her bolt pistol spent. Bayonetta paused beside her. "You're going to die here." Thorn looked up, managed something that might have been a smile. "I know. It's enough. I served. I witnessed. For what it's worth, you had spine. Conviction." Bayonetta's tone was gentler than Thorn had ever heard it. "You were wrong about me, but you were consistent about it. That counts for something." "Was I?" Blood flecked Thorn's lips. "Wrong. Guess we'll never know." Bayonetta turned to leave, then paused. "Die well, Canoness. Your Emperor is watching." She did not believe in the Emperor, but Thorn did. And dying with that faith intact was better than dying with doubts. Thorn watched her go, watched the warriors evacuate, watched the temple collapse around her. She died with her eyes open, bearing witness to the end. The Thunderhawk lifted as the temple's central spire collapsed into itself, the structure folding down like origami in reverse. Holt monitored casualty reports, 30% losses, acceptable within parameters. The anchor was still screaming, but the breach was closing. The ritual was broken. The immediate threat was contained. They had won, at the cost of 300 defenders, at the cost of a canoness who had earned a better death, at the cost of whatever remained of Enoch 9's population after the purges that would inevitably follow. But they had won. Back at the command post, Holt reviewed the engagement data, prepared his report for the Ordo Malleus, began calculating what came next. The anchor had 90 minutes left, maybe less. They would evacuate what could be evacuated, call for orbital support, ensure that nothing chaos-tainted escaped the planet. Bayonetta stood on the cathedral roof again, watching the sky. The rift was closing slowly, folding back into whatever spaces it had emerged from. Holt joined her, said nothing. She spoke without looking at him. "Your canoness. She died well. She died uselessly. Same thing in your Imperium." There was no mockery in her tone, just observation. At least she got to choose how it ended. That's all any of us get. That's all anyone needs. They stood in silence as the city burned itself out. As the anchor's scream reached a crescendo that suggested imminent catastrophic failure, Holt activated his Vox, began issuing evacuation orders, coordinated with orbital assets for extraction. The mission was concluding. Not successfully, not in failure, just concluding. In the spaces between worlds, Slaanesh noted the outcome with interest, filed it away, waited. There would be other worlds, other opportunities, other performances, and eventually, perhaps another encounter with a woman who understood excess, but refused to surrender to it. That would be entertaining. The anchor finally gave out 40 minutes later. By then, everyone worth saving had already left. The quarantine protocols took 3 days to implement, not because the procedures were complex. The Ordo Malleus had refined the art of post-chaos containment over 10 millennia. They knew exactly how to seal a world, how to identify contamination vectors, how to ensure that nothing tainted escaped to spread corruption beyond acceptable boundaries. The delay came from counting the survivors. 17,000 remained from a population that had once numbered in the billions. 17,000 who had endured the cults, the rituals, the demonic incursions, the collapse of every certainty they had built their lives around. 17,000 witnesses to what happened when the veil between worlds grew thin. Holt stood in the cathedral's ruins and watched his personnel process them. Each survivor subjected to psychic screening. Each mind examined for signs of lingering taint for corruption that might lay dormant for years before manifesting. The rate of execution was approximately 1 in 4, not because they were actively corrupted. Most of them were simply broken in ways that could not be repaired. Minds that had seen too much. Souls that had touched the warp and could not forget the sensation. People who would carry the contamination not through malice, but through trauma. Acceptable losses according to the calculations. Holt had stopped calculating 3 hours ago. Had stopped pretending the numbers meant anything beyond justification for choices already made. They burned the bodies in pyres that would rage for weeks. Consecrated flame consuming evidence. Cleansing through immolation. The ancient solution to problems that defied complex answers. Vale found him on the 3rd day of processing. The Grey Knight captain had remained on world to oversee the purge, to ensure that nothing Diamond touched escaped Imperial justice. The final sweep is complete. Vale's voice carried the flat certainty of someone reporting facts without judgment. All cult sites have been razed. All artifacts of corruption have been destroyed or secured for further study. The remaining population has been cleared for transport to penitent colonies. Casualties among your brothers, 14. A pause. Their gene seed has been recovered. Their names will be inscribed in the chapter's Hall of Remembrance. 14 Grey Knights dead. Each one irreplaceable. Each one worth 1,000 normal warriors. The math was brutal. Always was. And the asset Hoya, Vale used the term carefully. Clinical. The Umbra anomaly. Holt had been expecting this question. Had been preparing for it since the moment they evacuated from the temple ruins. Gone. Elaborate. She departed 36 hours ago, during the initial evacuation phase. Holt pulled up the logs on his slate, though he had memorized them already. Security protocols registered her presence at the landing bay. Then they didn't. No breach, no alarm. She simply ceased to be in one location and began being in none. Vale was silent for a moment. You permitted this, not a question. An accusation wrapped in observation. I did not prevent it. Holt met the Grey Knight's helm-hidden gaze. There's a difference. She remains unclassified, unbound, free to appear elsewhere and render our victory here meaningless. She rendered our victory here possible. The correction emerged sharper than Holt intended. Without her intervention, we would have lost the anchor in the first week. The entire operation would have collapsed into exterminatus protocols and acceptable sector-wide casualties. And now she walks free, carrying knowledge of Imperial operations, tactical doctrines, command structures. Brother Captain, Holt's voice carried the weight of authority he rarely needed to invoke directly. I have spent 3 decades identifying threats to the Imperium. I know corruption when I see it. I know heresy when it manifests. I know the difference between enemy and inconvenience. And what was she? Holt considered the question. Thought about Bayonetta standing in the temple ruins, rejecting a god with the casual dismissal of someone declining bad wine. Thought about her walking beside dying Thorn, offering respect without demanding conversion. Thought about power wielded with absolute control agency maintained against pressure that should have broken anyone. Neither. Something else entirely. He deactivated his slate. She was a variable that refused to conform to our taxonomies. And sometimes, Brother Captain, the greatest threat is not the enemy we understand, but the category we cannot name. Vale remained motionless for several seconds. Then slowly he nodded. The Ordo Malleus will be informed of this assessment. The Ordo Malleus wrote the protocols that allow for exactly this kind of operational discretion. Holt's tone was dry. They'll understand, or they'll execute me for judgment errors. Either way, the decision has been made. The gray knight departed without further comment. His footfalls echoed through the cathedral's empty nave, fading into silence. Holt stood alone among the ruins. The anchor's remains had been dismantled. Its components scattered its design, classified at levels that ensured only 3 people in the sector would ever know how it had been constructed. The Psyker choir's bodies had been given rites appropriate to their sacrifice. Their names recorded in ledgers that would outlive empires. The rift had closed. Not completely. Scars remained. Thin places in reality where the veil hung looser than it should, where sensitive individuals would always feel the whisper of something vast and hungry watching from beyond. But closed enough, stable enough, contained. The mission had succeeded. Holt activated his Vox, connected to the orbital assets waiting at the system's edge. This is Inquisitor Lord Severian Holt. Authorization code Obsidian Requiem. Confirm status for Exterminatus contingency. The response came after a moment's delay. Contingency standing ready, awaiting final authorization. He looked out over the city. Over the ruins of a world that had been dying for months and would take decades to recover, if recovery was even possible. Over the pyres, burning in configurations that suggested the dead would outnumber the living for generations. Authorization withheld. Enoch 9 is to be marked for quarantine and penitent colonization. Standard protocols. 50-year observation period before reclassification. Acknowledged. Updating records. The Vox went silent. Holt had the authority to order Exterminatus. Had the codes. Had the justification. One command and this entire world would burn clean, reduced to lifeless rock, purged of every taint and memory and possibility of contamination. He chose not to, not mercy, not compassion. Just the recognition that some victories should leave evidence. That some battles should be remembered rather than erased. That sometimes the lesson was worth more than the purity. 3 months later, when the Administratum reviewed his report, they would question this decision. Would note that total purge would have been cleaner, safer, more aligned with standard doctrine. By then, Holt would be 3 sectors away hunting different horrors. He would not defend his choice. Would simply note it in the record and move on. Because that was what command meant. Making decisions that would be questioned by people who had not been present. Accepting that judgment would come from those who had not stood in the ruins and counted the cost. The final transport lifted 2 days later. Holt watched it ascend through atmosphere still stained by corruption, watched it punch through into the clean void beyond the planet's grip. Below, Enoch 9 turned slowly in the dark, wounded, scarred, alive. The Imperium would return eventually. Would rebuild the cathedrals, would repopulate the hive cities, would resume the great grinding machinery of faith and bureaucracy that had sustained humanity for 10,000 years. They would not remember the woman who had walked among their defenders and laughed at gods. She would become a footnote, an unexplained variable in reports that would be classified and forgotten. A ghost in the machine that no one would acknowledge because acknowledging her would raise questions no one wanted answered. Holt knew this, accepted it. Somewhere in the galaxy, Bayonetta walked free, unbound by Imperial authority, untracked by inquisitorial assets, existing in the spaces between what the Imperium understood and what it pretended not to see. She would encounter other horrors, other entities that thought seduction was the same as conquest, other gods that believed power meant control. She would reject them as casually as she had rejected Slaanesh, because that was what she was, what she had always been. Not a savior, not a weapon, not a tool to be expended, just someone who had looked at a universe designed to break humanity and decided that it was not as impressive as it thought. Holt sat in his quarters aboard the transport, reviewing casualty reports and preparing his next assignment. The Ordo Malleus never stopped. Could not stop. The galaxy was too large and its horrors too numerous for rest to be anything but weakness. He pulled up the file marked Umbra Anomaly, Enoch 9 Incident. Read through his own observations, the tactical assessments, the philosophical questions that had no answers within Imperial doctrine. At the bottom, he added a single line: classification status unresolved. Recommend observation if encountered. Termination protocols ineffective. Nature remains unknown. He marked it for distribution to other Ordo Malleus assets. A warning, a note in the margins of Imperial consciousness. Then he archived it and moved on to the next world, the next threat, the next calculation of acceptable loss. Behind him, Enoch 9 fell away into memory. The scars remained, would always remain. Written into the planet's geology, its history, the genetic trauma of survivors who would pass their nightmares to descendants who had not been born yet. But it remained. That was enough. In the spaces between stars where light took centuries to travel, and silence was the only constant, a figure moved through the dark with purpose that needed no explanation. Bayonetta had places to be, entities to irritate, gods to disappoint. She had not saved Enoch 9 out of altruism, had not fought beside the Imperium out of shared ideology, had not rejected Slaanesh out of virtue. She had done it because the situation offended her sense of how things should work, because entities that thought they could rewrite reality to suit their aesthetic deserved to be embarrassed, because someone needed to demonstrate that power without control was just noise with ambition. The Imperium would never understand this, would continue to categorize and classify and attempt to fit the universe into taxonomies that made sense within their doctrines. She did not need them to understand. She had been what she was long before the Imperium learned to write its name across the stars, would continue being what she was long after they forgot how. Somewhere ahead, another world screamed. Another cult called to entities that did not love them. Another situation required someone who understood that style mattered as much as substance. She adjusted her glasses, checked her weapons, kept walking. The universe was large. Its horrors were numerous. Its gods were insufferable. Someone had to keep them honest. Behind her, across impossible distances on a world she would never see again, the survivors of Enoch 9 rebuilt their lives from fragments. They did not remember her name, could not describe her face, had only vague impressions of someone who had walked among them when the world ended and reality came apart. They told stories in the deep hours when the darkness felt too heavy. Stories about a figure who had faced demons and laughed, who had rejected gods and walked away, who had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, humanity had options beyond martyrdom and obedience. The ecclesiarchy would eventually suppress these stories, would rewrite them into acceptable parables about faith and sacrifice, would ensure that the official record showed only imperial forces and righteous fury defeating corruption. History belonged to those who wrote it down, but stories belonged to those who remembered. And some stories refused to die quietly. Holt's ship translated into the warp, beginning the long journey to the next crisis. He sat in his quarters and thought about the choices he had made. The deaths he had authorized. The victories that felt like defeats, and the defeats that somehow still counted as winning. He thought about a woman who had stood beside him in the ruins and spoken truth with the casual cruelty of someone who saw clearly and refused to lie about it. She died uselessly, he had said about Thorn. Same thing in your Imperium, Bayonetta had replied. She had been right. Everything in the Imperium died uselessly. Every sacrifice was wasted. Every victory was temporary. Every choice was just choosing which horror to prioritize. But they kept making choices, kept fighting, kept standing against darkness that could not be defeated, only delayed. That was what faith meant in the end. Not belief in victory, just refusal to surrender. Holt closed his eyes. Let exhaustion claim him for a few hours. When he woke, there would be new reports, new threats, new calculations of acceptable loss. The galaxy turned. Darkness pressed close. And somewhere in the infinite spaces between stars, predators both mortal and divine hunted prey that had long since forgotten how to hide. But some people had never learned to be prey. Some people looked at gods and saw entertainment. Some people walked through apocalypses and left them better than they found them, not through virtue, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to let reality have the final word. The Imperium would never admit such people existed, but in the quiet hours when even inquisitors allowed themselves doubt, Holt wondered if perhaps that was the Imperium's greatest failing. Not that it could not protect humanity, but that it could not acknowledge every form protection took. The ship sailed on through the warp, through spaces where physics was negotiable and madness was currency. Behind it, Enoch 9 healed slowly, imperfectly, painfully, but it healed. And across the galaxy in places, the Imperium did not monitor and could not comprehend others. Like Bayonetta walked their own paths, rejected their own gods, chose their own excess. The universe was vast. Its rules were flexible. And some people had always known that the difference between prison and palace was just whether you acknowledged the bars. In the end, that was the lesson Enoch 9 taught. Not that faith could defeat corruption, not that sacrifice guaranteed victory, just that sometimes when everything was burning and gods were laughing, and reality itself was negotiable, the right kind of stubborn could change outcomes. The rest was just details. The galaxy turned. The darkness pressed close. And in the spaces between those who refused to be defined, continued their ancient work, unacknowledged, unclassified, free, exactly as they preferred.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss out future video. Thank you for watching and we will see you next time.